Well, hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be joining you here today at the Oregon RTR conference. And thank you for welcoming me here to speak to educational leaders on delivering on the promise of literacy for all, leading the charge. As Beth said, I've worn a lot of different hats in my career. I've been around for a really, really long time, you can probably tell. And I have been a building and a district administrator in my career. And I know that the responsibility is heavy. I know that there is tremendous, tremendous responsibility. And I thank you for the work that you're doing. And I want to reiterate how important your leadership is in this. So a little bit more about me. I'm coming to you from just outside of the Windy City, Chicago. Like I said, I've been in education for a long time, worn a lot of hats. I've also been an organizational leader. But really, the through line of all my work has been early literacy. I have a passion for and a commitment to early literacy. I actually have a mission statement on my wall here in my office that says that I want to play whatever role I can to ensure that children read joyfully in the primary grades, enabling them to flourish as literate citizens of the 21st century. I believe that literacy is the greatest equity issue of our time, and that leading a literate life is not just a prerequisite to future success in school, but it can just bring great joy and understanding to life and the human condition. And I'm guessing you believe this as well, and that you share this mission with me, or you wouldn't be doing the work that you're doing. Teaching children to read is a challenge, and it is the most important we can do, and your leadership really matters. I just want to start out with a bow of gratitude to all of you. The Reading League, if you're not familiar with us, please join us. The Reading League is a mission-driven nonprofit, and our mission is to advance the awareness, understanding, and use of evidence-aligned instruction in schools. I'll tell you a little bit more about our work later in the presentation. Okay, so what are some topics to explore today? The first one I'd like to just really, again, reinforce is that your leadership really matters. I know you probably know this every day, but we know how you lead and what you do as a leader has a direct result on how our students achieve. The other thing I want to just kind of talk about is, does all mean all? I've been pondering this idea of all means all for a long time, ever since I read a book called Other People's Children by Lisa Delpit. And I just think it's something we need to continue to ask ourselves and remind ourselves. We're going to talk about, your leadership really matters in you knowing the evidence base of reading and how important it is that you have that content yourself. And we'll talk about, being a change agent for your teachers. And then finally, I want to, just leave you with some wrap up and closure and resources, because we have such a short time together and a pretty ambitious list of topics here that certainly there'll be more to follow up on. I also want you to know that I recognize that for many of you, this will be affirming, maybe review. That's great. For some of you, this might be right at your learning edge. And for some of you, this may be all new. And however you receive this information or take these ideas in is appropriate and good. And I'm here to support that. All right. So let's explore our first big idea, which is your leadership matters. I know you've seen that more than ever over these past few months. You've had to deal with some pretty significant challenges, and I sincerely applaud you on these, changes and decisions that you've had to make. Your leadership always matters, but I think now more than ever, literacy is the greatest mission we can fulfill. I think, we all recognize that some of our children are going to be behind as a result of the changes in their schooling. And some of our children may have increased trauma because of disruption. And both these factors make getting reading instruction right a top priority. So I want to start by drawing your attention back to an article that I did include in the resources. It's an article from a year and a half ago, but it was written by a couple of CAOs and a curriculum director. And what these district leaders identified is that in our nation, we have a reading crisis, and each in their own districts had to identify and kind of own that reading crisis. And so in this article, they kind of laid out, what do we need to know as leaders? So I made this available to you as a handout just because I think it's a very powerful article. And you probably know the data. According to NAEP, our nation's report card, only about a third of our kids in 4th and 8th grade are at or above proficiency in reading. And it's been strikingly consistent, with the exception of a slight upward tick right after the National Reading Panel or Reading First influenced our decision making. And I know this is probably not any news to you, and why it matters. You know, there are fallouts from low levels of literacy. People with low levels of literacy tend to be unemployed or underemployed. They may live in poverty, have higher rates of incarceration, may have higher rates of anxiety, etc. We also see increased emergency room visits when people cannot read basic instructions for medication and first aid. Again, I know this is not surprising to you, but I think this just mobilizes all around the urgency in our work and the importance of our work. And there have been reasons why these scores that I just shared with you have been so stagnant. Here are the most often cited reasons that schools and districts don't see significant change. One is that there's little evidence of systemic reading practices. Two, that intervention models are not designed around the needs of kids. Another reason for stagnant scores that have been identified is that data is not analyzed or instructions not aligned to that data. Data is not useful. Another one is that there's very little change in MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support. So if any of these apply to you, then I think these are just high-level ideas to keep in mind as we look to change our situation. So if we know that, you know, maybe a third of our kids are reading at proficient levels overall, and this doesn't necessarily apply to you in your own situations, but if it is that, or if it is, you know, anywhere near that, I want to contrast that with what's possible. So what percentage of students should be able to read at grade level by the end of 3rd grade when given appropriate and adequate instruction and intervention? So just go ahead and jot in the chat what percentage of kids, what's possible? What do you think? All right, we've got 85, 95, 70, 80, 95, 95, 100, 100, 80. Okay, all right. Wow, you guys are right on target. You know, we know that it's about 95% or more of our children that we can teach to read. And that's the great hope in all of this, that we can teach virtually all of our kids to read. So I think what we have to do then as educational leaders is take a good hard look at our own data. And if there is a disconnect between what is and what is possible, that's the opportunity. But I also want us to recognize, listen, there's, you know, to borrow from that article that I referenced, there's no shame here. There's no blame here. We just have an urgency. We have unfinished business, and there's an urgency to move forward with the knowledge to let the evidence guide us as we strive for this delivering on the promise of literacy for all. And, you know, I always like to reiterate for our leaders is that many of our teachers did not have this body of research that I'll be, you know, overviewing today in their teacher preparation. And I always say to teachers, you know, I started out as a teacher. I didn't have this either. Now I know that was a long time ago, but, you know, I didn't have this body of evidence either. And it's not uncommon. So we have to give ourselves grace to grow and learn, just like our kids, right? Now, I know also that during this time, a lot of us are thinking, I can't take on something new. I can't add anything to what I'm already doing. I cannot work any harder. And I know that there isn't a person listening today that isn't working as hard as they can. I know that. I think this is not about working harder, it's about working smarter, because if we do know this evidence base, it becomes almost like a litmus test to help us make, you know, decision A or decision B. Now, sometimes that requires us to stop what's not working, and that might be the hardest. Many of us as teachers hold practices very dear, and maybe these practices have worked for many, if not most of our kids. I think the key challenge is to think about what are the highest utility practices with the greatest bang for the buck, which reach the largest number of children. And I know that, you know, last year for any of our teachers who were teaching in virtual space, they probably had to really pare down their teaching to the essentials. And that requires us to choose practices with the highest impact. But that's why, the support that you offer your teachers is critically important. That's why we do the work that we do at the Reading League, because supporting each other is really important. Okay, so your leadership matters. So let's move to our second idea, which is the idea that does all mean all? When we say all kids can learn to read, do we really mean it? And I want to share an experience I had last month. I facilitated a panel discussion at this literacy summit in Montana, where some local principals and superintendents, shared their transformative journeys. And one of the superintendents, in full transparency, said that the day that he confronted himself with the idea that all means all, it started him down the road of his own growth in understanding the evidence in early reading. And that was just powerful for me when he shared his story. So to explore this idea a little bit further, I want to have a little activity with you. And I'd like you to look at these 24 kindergartners. And I want you to ask yourself some questions. And I want you to pretend that these 24 kids represent the typical distribution of the population in the attainment of reading as a learned skill. I'm going to say that again. Think of those 24 kids as representing the typical distribution of the population in the attainment of reading as a learned skill. Okay, so and you don't have to write a thing in the chat. You can just kind of do this, in your own space. And if you're with colleagues, do it with your colleagues. How many of those 24 kids will learn to read in a seemingly effortless way, or even come to school already reading? And by the way, I don't mean reading behaviors. Some of our kids come in with reading behaviors. I mean really reading with accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. Okay. How many will learn to read relatively easily with most any kind of instruction? How many will require code-based, explicit, systematic, cumulative, sequential instruction? And how will require that and more intensive repetitions? Okay, I just want to give you a minute, just a minute to ponder that. And again, you don't have to really write anything in the chat. Just kind of think to yourself about how many kids in that group of 24 fit into each of these categories. All right, I know I didn't give you very long to ponder this idea, but let's kind of see what, statistically speaking, we know about this distribution. So, oh, that's not working. Let's see. There we go. So about 1 in that classroom of 24, or about 5% of us, read almost effortlessly or seemingly effortlessly. And I know that many times when I do this activity with the groups of teachers, many of them say, well, I don't remember learning to read, right? It was relatively, I kind of intuited how it worked, and I was a good reader, and I loved school. One of the reasons I wanted to be a teacher. But that's really a very small percentage of us. About 8 in that classroom of 24 are going to learn to read relatively easily with almost any instruction. So about 1/3 of us are going to be fine. But look at how many, 50% and sometimes more of us require a very specific type of instruction. And about 2 to 4 of us, or about 10%, require all that and more. So reflecting on that, just jot something in the chat. What conclusions can you draw? Just reflecting on that distribution. What conclusions can you draw? Just write something in the chat. Explicit, systematic instruction for all. Effective instruction is critical, beneficial for all. We need to be systematic if all means all. Great thoughts, everybody. Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. So, and by the way, this is the Bean in Chicago, for any of you who have visited our fair city. If not, come on down. We're reopening. All right. So I want to draw your attention to this graphic, which I also provided as a handout. Maybe some of you have seen this. This is from Nancy Young, and I'm using it with her permission. And it is basically what's called a ladder of reading. And I just like it. It's a nice infographic. She shows, that kind of breakdown that I just shared with you. And what's most important, and I think we could, for example, kind of dig into, does that 10 to 15% at the bottom, does that represent just people with dyslexia, or is it readers who struggle? But we're not going to nitpick that. We're going to look over to the right side and think about what the implications are this, which you just named in the chat. When you shared that tier 1 needs to be strong. And you shared that, let's see what else we got here. By teaching in the way that supports the 2 to 4, we are supporting all children. Somebody wrote that. Thank you for that. Yes. Notice over to the right, structured literacy approach, or a sequential, systematic, cumulative, explicit approach is really good for everybody, but it's absolutely imperative for most of us. And I always go back to the delightful Anita Archer, who I think is just wonderful. And she always says explicit instruction, good for everybody, but it's critical for most. Now, why is that? Well, I always go back to our friend Marianne Wolf. And this book, Reader Come Home, by the way, if you haven't read it, it's really great. It's about, developing the reading brain in the digital age, which I know is, a point of curiosity for all of us. But her groundbreaking book, 2009, Proust and the Squid, I also highly recommend. She basically, makes the point that human beings were never born to read, because, we know that while some children seemingly effortlessly appear to begin reading, the majority of us have to be taught. When you think about the timeline of humanity, spoken language has been with us for, 100,000 years, but reading and writing are a relatively recent invention. If this is the present day, right? Reading and writing are a recent human invention, only around 5,000 years. So spoken language is kind of hardwired inside the human brain, and our brain is adapted to language processing, but the written code hasn't been around long enough for us to have developed a reading brain. But the neural circuitry, and I keep pointing to the left hemisphere here, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that neural circuitry that takes place in the language portion of our brain for most efficient processing is created primarily through instruction, because it's not a naturally occurring thing. And I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this, because when I came up as a teacher, the prevailing theory was that learning to read is like learning to speak. And if we take those same conditions, children learn to speak through modeling and immersion and exploration. And the idea was, if we just create those same conditions with print, we as teachers model good writing, good reading, we immerse them in print, we let them explore, that somehow reading is acquired in the same way that language is acquired. And we know that that simply isn't true. And I believe many of our children were left behind because of that foundational belief, right? So instruction really matters. Now I want you to think about this. What percentage of students should meet? Okay, there we go. Normed reading proficiency targets with tier 1 instruction alone. You don't have to write anything in the chat box here, just think to yourself. Which percentage of students should meet them with additional intervention? And which students are likely to continue to struggle to learn to read, but they still deserve continued instruction? Think about that for a minute. And looks like this. Okay. About 85% of us, we should be able to, with good evidence-based instruction delivered well, we should be able to meet about 85% of our students. And of course, if you see more kids in intervention than this, it may be a tier 1 issue. And I think this is really important, because we know that if we have an overabundance of kids that need tier 2 services, tier 3 services, intervention services, it overburdens and overtaxes our systems. It overtaxes the resources of personnel and materials. And I know you all know this, because you're running buildings and you're running districts. We can't overburden that intervention piece, because then we don't have the resources to meet the needs of all of those kids. So it's really all about taking a prevention-oriented approach. And I think, Joe Torgerson does some really nice work here in illustrating the gap that we can create if we don't attack this as a prevention orientation versus intervention. In kindergarten, it might take up to 15 to 30 minutes over a short amount of time to close the gap. So we've got some kids entering school already at some deficits. If we can use some good screening assessments, identify those kids, and provide some additional intensive work, it can take a relatively short amount of time. By first grade, it's more time. By second grade, it's more. By third grade on up, if the gap is so wide between children on a normal reading trajectory and children who are struggling, it could take such a long time and so many hours a day to close the gap that it almost becomes insurmountable. That's what we're trying to avoid. Is we're trying to think, okay, how do we identify kids early? How do we provide good first instruction? How do we really nail it in tier one so that we have kids who are really thriving with good first instruction? So we think about that gap. We can narrow the gap if instruction is evidence aligned, if it is comprehensive, explicit, systematic, and targeted. It covers all the essential elements, all the strands of Scarborough's rope, which I'm going to share in a moment. If it's explicit, I do, we do, you do, if it follows a system from least complex to most complex, if we have cumulative review built right in, if it relies, again, relentless focus on tier one to inform, tiers 2 and 3. If we have really good, valid, reliable assessments, and if we are including all of our learners, regardless of zip code, ethnicity, dialect, language, all of our children deserve, obviously, that equal, equitable access to literacy practice grounded in the science of reading. And of course, supported by good professional development and classroom resources. Again, I go back to the fact that, a lot of us didn't learn this in our teacher preparation programs. And so we need to be really good, informed consumers of resources that are out there. And for that, we need really terrific grounding in professional development. And again, to just reiterate this, your engagement is critical. I'll let you read this to yourself. Whether you're a principal or whether you're a district level administrator or whether you're a building leader in some capacity, we know we can't lead the charge unless we understand the content. Now, we don't need to understand it on a day-to-day practice level, but we have to have enough understanding so that our passion can drive and sustain the change. So with that, let's dip our toes into this. What does it mean? What does evidence-aligned instruction really mean? Now, obviously, we're only going to skim the surface today. And I know you have so many great speakers at the conference. You're going to go deeper into some of these key areas, but I just want to share some of these key principles. Again, for some of you, this is review and affirmation. For some of you, this might be, growing edge. And for some of you, this might be all new stuff. So let's start with just the term science of reading. What does it mean? What does it mean? And why is this so important? Well, there's been a lot of buzz in the last, few years around this term, science of reading. If you're not familiar with Emily Hanford's audio documentaries on American Public Media, please tune into them. They're a terrific listen when you're taking a walk. And it's really well-researched reporting around the science of reading. So please check these out if you haven't already. And I think she really elevated the conversation to all stakeholders, not just us in the educational community. But what is it? What is the science of reading? Well, I'd like you to please to read this to yourself. So one of the initiatives that we started at the Reading League is called the Science of Reading, a Defining Movement, where we worked with other organizations, one of which was NIHouse, which I know you had a keynote with Tracy Whedon today. And we kind of crafted what is a simple definition, which is that first line, and then some supporting statements. And we're working on a defining guide, which will have additional pieces. And you can actually just check out the website and see where we are with that defining guide. I think you'll really appreciate that. But when I share this, people say, whoa, I didn't know that this has been around for over 40 years. I didn't know this was interdisciplinary. The truth is reading is the most studied aspect of human learning, right? And when we say interdisciplinary, these are the different fields of discipline: developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, communication sciences, education, implementation science, developmental linguistics, and of course, neuroscience, which has been a huge boon to our understanding. And there have, of course, been major research syntheses, including our own National Reading Panel, our own report of the early national literacy panel. And all of these studies are really set out to learn, how do children learn to read? Why don't some kids learn to read? And what do we need to do about it? So I'll let you go ahead and read these to yourselves as well. We have a lot of evidence to really understand and draw conclusions about how to best teach reading. Now, a lot of times though, when I share this, people go, oh, Laura, you can make research say whatever you want. But that isn't actually true if we understand what makes research valid. And if this is something you haven't checked out yet, I recommend it. It's something to make available to your teachers. This is from the Stanoviches, and this was published in 2003, but it's extremely user-friendly for those of us who perhaps, in our coursework didn't have any understanding of study design. We didn't understand, what's experimental, what's quasi-experimental, what's replicable. What does it mean to be peer reviewed? This is a great, just a terrific resource. It's free. Download it. Very helpful. I do want to have a little caveat here, though. It's important to recognize that not everything you do will have empirical evidence behind it. Okay, and that's really important. We look to these robust studies, the empirical evidence, as guideposts. Then we follow best practice from those understandings, right? And at our recent conference, at the Reading League conference, if any of you tuned in, Steve Dykstra did a really great session on this. And I'm going to give you an example that he shared. There's strong evidence for teaching phonics. Phonics is important to reading, and instruction in phonics yields better results than no instruction in phonics, right? We know that. But there is, no empirical evidence that says how many minutes a day, which phonetic elements, in what order. Do we use manipulatives? Do we use letters? So for those choices, we have to use, case studies or anecdotal evidence along with data from assessments to guide our instructional decision making. But the guidepost, that there's evidence for teaching phonics is the North Star, right? It's one of the North Stars that we follow. So the big idea, here is that if instruction matters, we have a robust body of research to guide us. We know about the process of reading and the process of learning to read. Those become the frameworks. And along those lines, I want to share with you a couple of frameworks that I know you're probably familiar with, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. The simple view of reading is, of course, one of our key frameworks. It's the big picture of reading. It's the equation for reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is a product of word recognition or decoding, and language comprehension, which I also think is nice to refer to it as linguistic comprehension, right? Think about that, because we think about all the elements that go into language comprehension. I think linguistic comprehension is a nice way to put it. Simply put, decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. And as you know, the important thing here is that it's a product, it's not a sum, because it's the integration and the interplay of these two domains that results in reading comprehension. It's not the additive quality, okay? So the fact that it is a multiplicative equation is really important. And you can put numbers behind that. You can say, oh, one means evidence of. So a child can decode, that would be one. But let's say the child does not have a robust vocabulary or background knowledge or understanding of linguistic components of language, of spoken language. That might be a 0, 1 times 0 is 0. Same thing is true. Children may come, with a lot in terms of their linguistic comprehension, but they haven't yet learned to decode. 0 times 1 is still 0. So the beauty of this is that it reiterates the importance of both of these aspects in reading comprehension. Now, however, with that being said, we do shift instructional priorities as children enter school and as they progress through school. You know, as a child, as a reader is developing the ability to get the text off the page, most of his or her brain energy is devoted to that part of the simple view. So early on, we need to concentrate our instructional attention on building that decoding word recognition piece so that our brain energy allocation can shift to devoting more energy to thinking our way through text or navigating our way through text, utilizing those language comprehension strands in strategic ways. So I hope that makes sense. So even though they're equally important, how we process, how we approach them instructionally differs as children are developing as readers. So that framework, I think, is really critical to think about when we think about, you know, the domains of reading and we think about instructional priorities. Another framework, which is Hollis Scarborough's visual metaphor of the many strands woven into skilled reading. And this is a very dynamic, I like the use of the rope because it's very dynamic. And it shows how these the sub-skills of language comprehension and word recognition are integrated as skilled reading is accomplished. And they're like strands in a rope because they become more integrated and intertwined as the reading skill develops. So when we think about, you know, what do we bring to the table and what do we glean from interactions with text in the language comprehension domain, we bring our background knowledge and our vocabulary understandings. With interactions with text, we begin to understand those language structures. We utilize our verbal reasoning, especially when it comes to inferential comprehension. Our literacy knowledge, all the way from, you know, concepts of print through genre. Word recognition, of course, phonologic awareness, that big umbrella term that encompasses the sound systems of our language. And that combined with the print system allows us to blend orthography and phonology to decode and encode. And ultimately through that process of phonic decoding repeated, we orthographically map words for instantaneous recognition, almost as if by sight. That's what we mean by sight recognition. And what, again, the beauty of this is that over time, those language comprehension strands become increasingly strategic for our use in making sense of text, while this bottom strand becomes increasingly automatic, right? It goes underground. You and I, when we move across text, you know, we don't put a lot of conscious attention to this piece because it's increasingly automatic for our use. And as Hollis Scarborough says, this represents skilled reading. She was very clear that it's not really about comprehension. This is really about skilled reading, and this represents skilled reading. Now, I think this, you know, to me, this really conveys some complex ideas in a very elegant way. You know, we think about the word recognition is represented by a braid. And even though Hollis Scarborough says she didn't intentionally, you know, choose a braid, she said, this is what I could draw. And she talks about creating. But think about braiding. You know, if you know anything about braiding, if you've ever braided anything, when you braid those three strands, it has to be deliberate and methodical and sequential. And we like to keep it really tight so that there's no gaps. And that's very much like teaching those word recognition skills, right? So I think some of the key truths about the rope, proficient reading or skilled reading rests on a gradual mastery of a number of component language skills. And they're all interconnected and they can be taught in an explicit approach. Those are just some frameworks that I think are really important for us to explore. And that's really the why. I mean, I think about, you know, one thing that we need to know as educators is the why. You know, what does the process of learning to read look like? Because then we can start asking ourselves, okay, how does instruction need to match that? And that leads us to the question of what? You know, what are the areas of instruction that make up the major components of reading? And for that, of course, we want to go back to the work of the National Reading Panel. Major components of reading, of course, are phonologic and phonemic awareness, sound system and phoneme awareness, the ability to understand and manipulate those discrete sounds. Phonics, which includes not just instructions in letters and sounds or graphemes and phonemes, but includes structural analysis of words, includes spelling, Fluency, reading with reasonable accuracy, appropriate rate, and expression. Vocabulary, understanding of words and word meanings. And comprehension, when you think about the understanding of connected text, it is considered an essential element of reading, but it is probably more accurately a goal of reading and the result of the mastery and the integration of all of these components of effective instruction. And by the way, last year at this time, the Reading League published a journal that was a reflection of 20 years after the National Reading Panel. So you might want to check out that, dig out that old journal article if you, or journal edition if you haven't seen it, and notice it's in the. If any of you that remember the National Reading Panel report, it was this apple green color, so that's why we color coded it here. But what we had is we had some of the original National Reading Panel members, like Linnea Airy and Tim Shanahan, write kind of a retrospective. What have we learned in 20 years? And kind of the good news is nothing's been disproven. We've deepened our understanding and broadened our understanding, but those findings have really been corroborated over time, which I think is very reassuring. This is a handout that I made available to you. And I know we have, I believe I saw in our chat box, we had at least one person from Arkansas. Go Arkansas. This is from the Arkansas RISE Reading Initiative for Student Excellence. And I just like this. I think it's a great summary of the components of the science of reading. There are 34 points in all, arranged with the what, why, and the how. And you may want to use this with your staff. I know I've used it in different convenings of teachers where we've read it. We've kind of, circled ones that we're curious about. We've starred ones that are affirming. We put a question mark by ones that we doubt. And then it provides us with kind of a rich discussion around the essential components of reading. Okay, so how does this all fit together? Well, when we think about these 5 components, how do they map onto the simple view? Well, phonemic awareness and phonics are clearly the what that lead into that word recognition piece. Fluency straddles the 2 domains of the simple view because it is an observable characteristic of a reader who is moved from simply decoding to automatic word recognition, and it is a facilitator of language comprehension because as we're fluent readers, we're freeing up that cognitive space to apply those language comprehension skills as we read. Okay, if that makes sense. Vocabulary is clearly part of the language comprehension, and comprehension, again, when we think about the 5 components model, could refer to those skills that go into building language comprehension, or we also think of it as the outcome of reading comprehension. And as I said before, in the early grades, although these components are all important, we tend to focus on some of those essential foundational skills when we think about that brain energy allocation. So let me ask you this, in the early to middle elementary grades, most poor readers' difficulties revolve around decoding, okay? So think about that. And think about like what percentage of our readers have difficulty around decoding. About 80%, about 80%. So that's why this word recognition piece is the foundation, because these other processes really, really depend on it. So let me take you through. So let me take you through this in a different way. I want to just share with you what I call the self-perpetuating cycle of reading success. So when we think about those foundational skills, how do they build towards successful reading? So all reading starts with a base of language. Talked about that. Reading is a language-based endeavor. We teach children about the phonologic system, the sound system, and we connect that to the print system to allow us to phonically decode. Through the process of phonic decoding and repeating that process, we're able to orthographically map words for instantaneous recognition, for instantaneous retrieval. Now, some of our kids require just a few repetitions for that word to be orthographically mapped for automatic retrieval. Some of our kids need lots of repetition. So that's why when we go back to that initial model of the ladder of reading, many of our kids need all that explicit instruction and then intensive repetition, right, on their targeted skills. When we have words available to us for automatic retrieval, then we can become a fluent reader. And when we are fluent readers, we tend to be more engaged in reading, right? If you're successful in reading, you tend to be more engaged, and more engaged, the more reading practice you get. And the more reading practice you get, the more your vocabulary grows. You know, we know that in the early years, vocabulary growth is primarily a result of conversation and oral language. But once kids become readers, most of our new vocabulary is learned through reading. They say from about 3rd grade up. So we want to have this extensive reading practice to help build the vocabulary and help build those content knowledge of academic language through that extensive reading. Once we have access to that, we can deeply comprehend complex text, and that is what's truly motivating, right? I read something recently. It was kind of about how the science of reading doesn't include motivation, that motivation should be part of the science of reading. But I would argue that motivation could be considered a product of the science of reading, and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle of motivation to read. So when we think about this, if we give children incremental steps of success all along this way, then that's going to perpetuate the cycle of success, right? Okay, now I know that I have talked a lot at you, so I'm going to give you a moment to reflect, and feel free to, write something in the chat box or not. You can just reflect on your own. What's a key takeaway? What's a next step? Just based on the ideas we've explored so far. We've explored the idea that instruction counts, prevention orientation versus intervention. We've explored what is the science of reading. We looked at the simple view, the rote model, and the essential components. So I'm just going to give you, let's see, I'm just looking at my time here. I think I'll just give you maybe 3 minutes till 5 after the hour to just pause if you want to get up and stretch, but just pause and think, reflect. What does everything we've talked about so far mean to you in your work? Okay, so just pause for a moment here. And if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I can answer them toward the end. Okay, I think we'll come back together. Thank you for your comments, and we can address some of the questions too that have come up as we move through this, as we move toward the end here. Okay, so hope you had a chance just to kind of process all of this. And again, for some of you, perhaps it's review and affirmation. It's all good. So let's talk about, steps in leading change in your buildings and in your districts to support your teachers. Now, this is extremely simplified, but I want to just kind of give you an overview of what we consider transformative change. It's just an overview. Perhaps it's, again, affirming the path you're already on, or it might just start you on your journey. So let's talk about specific actions that you can take for transformative change that allow you to both lead that charge and support your teachers. Okay, so I want to make it very clear, we're not talking about additive change. We're not talking about adding to what you already do. Additive change is layering new components on top of existing structures and knowledge and belief. And I think all of us would agree that that is simply not sustainable. It's not something that we can do over the long term. Now, I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I think is frightening for teachers when we start talking about change is they, automatically go to, well, I don't have any more room in my day. And I've worked with schools or districts where it has been about additive change. It's kind of like, they look at their core program and they say, well, gosh, our core program doesn't have enough phonics. So let's add on a phonics program. Well, the truth is, there isn't enough time in a day to just glue something else onto an existing core program. So this isn't really about that. This is really about, transformational change, which is changing our underlying knowledge, beliefs, and structures to think about a different way of doing things. And I could just share with you, my own journey. I mentioned earlier that when I started out as a teacher, one of the prevailing foundational beliefs was that children learn to read in the same way that they learn to speak. And so that if I created those same conditions in my classroom, voila, reading would happen. So then when I saw, that, not even half of my kids could learn to read that way, it wasn't just changing my practice. It wasn't just adopting a set of materials. I had to really go back and dig deep into that underlying belief about how children learn to read. And I had to learn, and it was during the reading first years, I had to learn about, what do we know about the process of learning to read? And knowing that process then becomes the driver for instructional change, right? So it's fundamental beliefs and ideas that we really have to examine on our journey. So that leads us to building our knowledge, building our, and when we say everyone, we mean everyone. And we're not talking about a one shot, what I'm doing for you today is a one shot. And we're not really talking about that, right? I mean, sometimes a one shot can mobilize people and motivate people and just get a spark going. But what we're really talking about is, real deep knowledge building. And I mentioned this earlier, but go ahead and read this to yourself. Oh, all of these studies show that many of us were not exposed to this science of reading in our professional preparation. Now, again, no blame, no shame. We didn't know what we didn't know, and we learn and we grow. We learn, we grow, right? And that requires us then to kind of take an honest evaluation of our current practices. What do we do now? How does it align with this evidence base? What is the process? This is the process that takes time, right? Because we can build knowledge. I mean, we can, teach teachers the fundamentals of the science of reading, but until we bridge it to practice, it doesn't really matter, right? So we have to, as we're building our knowledge, take an inventory of all the programs we use, the ways we teach, and then start holding them up to that evidence. Now, and this is a really interesting exercise. And maybe some of you have done this in your buildings, your districts, but to literally sit down with your teachers and list everything, every program you use, every website you go to download resources, all the stuff that you have at your fingertips, just list it all. And it might be surprising just the sheer number of resources that teachers are, choosing from. And then it's a matter of kind of saying, okay, which of these are really yielding, yielding the results that we want, or giving me the tools that I need as a teacher. Now, I do want to, again, go back to what I said about not all practices will be at the center of that evidence bullseye, as Dr. Steve Dykstra said in his conference session for our national conference a couple of weeks ago. He talked about the targets, right? And the center of the target is this evidence bullseye that has empirical evidence for it. All of our practices won't be at the center of the bullseye because there isn't empirical evidence for everything we do. But how do we keep close to that, right? And how do we build our practices based on something other than I like it? That's essentially what he said. So this isn't something we do all at once. As we build knowledge, we continue to ask ourselves, how does this hold up? And this takes time. So as we acquire knowledge and we do an honest examination of our resources and our practices, then we start to do what we call pull weeds and plant flowers. And pulling weeds and planting flowers really gets us to thinking, what needs to go, what needs to stay, and what do we need to do? Do we need a rototiller? Do we need to just plow under the whole thing? Do we need a landscape designer? Do we need someone to come in and help us, design our garden here? So how do we pull the weeds or the things that aren't serving us to make room for the flowers? Because you can't have both. You can't, again, this is where transformative change is different from additive change. Okay? So, but that doesn't happen until we're building knowledge, we're examining current practices. You know, I always say to people, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, don't think that because you're not getting the scores that you want, that everything has to go. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know, do you all remember the Father of the Bride movie? When Franck comes in, he says, oh, it is lovely. I change everything, right? So we don't want to change everything. We want to be careful and discerning in what stays and what goes. Now, I've said this several times today, and I know somebody wrote it in the chat. I think this is worth repeating, is that our first focus really is that tier 1 instruction. And how do we create a program? And by program, I don't mean a boxed program. I just mean overall program, which includes resources, right? But how do we create an instructional program that has, for example, you know, our daily schedule, that has our instructional resources, that has our assessments? How do we create the whole program that really focuses on tier 1 and then use our knowledge of the evidence to make those instructional decisions? You know, we have to think that if we're not reaching 85% or more of our kids with tier 1, we may be overburdening our intervention resources, and we may want to take a closer look at tier 1. I love this graphic that's been developed by Jan Hasbrook and Deb Glazer, and they've allowed me to use it with their permission. This is from their book on fluency, and it's really just the instructional cycle. So, you know, step 1 of every instructional cycle is to deliver high quality evidence-aligned tier 1 instruction to everybody. And from that, identify which students are at risk. And from that, develop individual needs and plan instruction. From that, implement the plan. From that, monitor their progress and make a decision to change or continue the plan, right? We all know this. Really important to think about, how does data fit into this? And do we have really good screening? And is the screening, when I say really good, what I mean by that, is it usable? Is it something a teacher can do? You know, is it a 1-minute screen like ORF, right? That allows us to take a snapshot just to identify those kids who might be at risk. So it has to be usable, it has to be valid, it has to be reliable. And then from that, you know, we can identify those kids at risk, and that's when we use the diagnostic assessments. And that's when we drill deeper. And our diagnostic assessments need to really pinpoint where's the gap, right? If we know how children learn to read, if we know that predictable progression, if we know about that instructional cycle, or with the cycle of success, right? Where has it broken down? Where has it broken down? How to identify that, right? So this is so much more than just saying, oh, well, this student's an F reader, this student's an A reader, that doesn't tell me anything. But when I can identify that this student's gap area is blending, you know, they've got phoneme awareness and they have letter knowledge, but putting those two together and blending them is not happening, then I can know what instructional steps to take, right? And we need data that can allow us to progress monitor. And of course, you know, when we think about, you know, benchmarking, you know, benchmark screening, that's just done beginning, middle, and end of year, right? Monitoring is shorter intervals because we want to track progress and make continued response to that intervention. Okay. Again, I'm sure this is reviewed for all of you, but I just want to point out how critically important that tier 1 is. And again, how critically important the data is. You know, are our assessments valid and reliable? And do they give us what we need? You know, do they serve the intended purpose? The fourth bullet I think is really important. Is the data we get worth the instructional time it takes to collect it? Okay. If not, maybe we should rethink the data we're getting. Do we have both formative and summative? And so do we need to pick out assessment weeds and flowers? You know, do we need to weed out some of our assessments to plant some good flowers? There's a really good resource. It's maybe some of you know it. It's an academic screening tools chart. And the website is charts.intensiveintervention.org. Maybe some of you know this. But it's a really good, like kind of a screening tool. It just kind of shows you lots of different assessment tools and what they're designed to do. Now, what do we do with the data, right? So we've got some good assessment tools, but what do we do with it? And I think it's really important to think about, how do we get comfortable using and sharing the data, right? How do we develop procedures at the systems and building and classroom level that allow us to really look at our data and to be honest about it? Some of the most effective systems change involve the use of data rooms, where all student data is posted and that data is visited continually to just adjust instruction. So we have to get comfortable really looking at this and saying, okay, what is this telling me? And what do I need to do instructionally? And I guess the final step is that don't stop. And transformative change takes years to achieve. And it's maintaining and sharpening. It's really never complete. And that's, I think, both reassuring and challenging. Just when we think, years, really? Just remember, and this probably if you're a seasoned leader, that you never take your foot off the gas, right? But what's possible? Well, what's the good news is that with research-based instruction, the percentage of first graders below the 30th percentile can be reduced to 4 to 6%. At 95%, everyone really can be taught to read. Okay. All right, so I know we're kind of coming up against our end time here. So I want to just leave you with some wrap up and some resources. So let's wrap up our time together by talking about those must-haves. What are the must-haves for instruction? Well, instruction really needs to be evidence-based, and this goes back to some points I made earlier: comprehensive, explicit, systematic, targeted, guided by valid and reliable assessments, inclusive of all learners, and supported by effective professional development and good classroom resources. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about resources, I wasn't just talking about boxed programs, right? However, I do believe teachers need good resources in their hands, right? We need tools. I've been in schools and districts where I've been told our teachers don't need a program. They just are good teachers. Okay, but a good teacher has good resources in her hands to make her life, manageable, right? And there are good resources out there. So are there other resources I've left for you? Some of you have probably seen this. It's a toolkit just for leaders. It's for superintendents, CAOs, directors of curriculum instruction, literacy coordinators, principals, and it's designed to provide practical ideas for integrating scientifically based strategies for early reading instruction. It's terrific. It's maybe some of you have seen it. It includes sample syllabi. It includes a discussion guide for you to use with your staff, talking points, ideas on how to allocate reading time, how to teach foundational skills, gives you some checklists, some what to look for as you move into classrooms. So that's available to you. We also have this, I wrote a white paper on the science of reading that just kind of summarizes some of these foundational ideas that we discussed today. Another great resource for you is to connect with us, connect with the Reading League. If you're not familiar with the Reading League, just join us, www.thereadingleague.org. Becoming a member is free. We offer lots of things. Some are free, some are paid for. We offer that journal subscription I mentioned earlier. We really are striving to create a journal that is research to practice. So check that out. We offer live and live streamed events. We have a national conference on October 13th. You can still register, and you will have all the virtual sessions for life. So have them forever. So Beth mentioned my podcast. I got to give a shout out. Yes, teaching, reading, and learning. I have had just the incredible privilege of speaking with guests such as Louisa Moats and Emily Hanford, the reporter that I mentioned earlier, David Kilpatrick, Tim Shanahan, Anita Archer, love her, Linnea Airy, one of the legacy people that we all look toward. Parker Palmer, Marianne Wolf, Dr. Sean Robinson, Dr. Dyslexia Dude, Tracy Whedon. Her podcast is going to drop on November 2nd. I know you know her. So, and we have some practitioner sessions too. So please check that out. We offer professional development, including an online academy, which is designed to be very intimate, small cohort, just high quality interactions. These free resources on our knowledge-based webpage, our YouTube channel, check those out. And we form chapters. We have 18 chapters across the country, and we do not have a chapter in Oregon. So if you are an Oregon native, please contact me if you'd like to start a Reading League chapter in your state. And please follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. I'm involved in another initiative I just want to tell you about because many administrators have found this helpful. We have formed an organization, myself and some people from Barksdale, Hill Learning Center, the Right to Read Project, and Reading Teachers Top 10 Tools came together, and we created what we call a short course. And we actually created it for Teach for America. And then once they used it, we thought, well, let's make this available to everybody. It's a 10-hour course, 5 modules. Many administrators like it because it's not really deep in the weeds. It's just a short course. The reason we're called Big Dippers, by the way, is if you take all of our locations and connect the dots, it looks like the Big Dipper. But check it out if you're interested in going a little bit deeper in the science of reading, but you don't want to go too heavily into it. It's what we call the short course. And make sure your teachers know about this TV show called the Reading League's Reading Buddies. It's free, it's on YouTube, it's a 20-minute show for children, and it teaches those foundational skills of reading. It features a cool little puppet named Dusty. I also had them as guests on my podcast too. It's really fun to interview a puppet. Okay, so I just want to take a couple minutes and see if we have questions in our chat. Oh, it looks like somebody knows about the Big Dippers. Beth, survey, excellent presentation. Oh, okay. Okay, somebody put the link in. Anything else? Beth, do you see anything here question-wise that I need to answer?
I didn't. I think mostly this was just very affirming for people and energizing and invigorating. I know I felt like, okay, we can continue to do this work because this is the work that needs to be done. So yeah. Oh, that is a question people have had.
Yes.
Are the slides going to be available?
I can send you a PDF of the slides if you
Okay.
like. Sure.
Yep. And I'll stick them in the folder.
Okay. I already put quite a few things for handouts, so I didn't want to overload people, but I can share with some of those slides with you, sure.
Thank you.
I do want to leave you with Tracy, and I know you all heard from Tracy today, but one thing I wanted to share with you is, she's part of this What is the Science of Reading.org, our defining movement. And we have a preamble to our defining movement, and here she reads that preamble, and she just does such a lovely job that I would love for you all to hear this as a way in closing out today.
Humankind's most precious treasure is our children, and our future depends on them. We recognize literacy as a fundamental human right that empowers individuals in a society. We also know that grim life outcomes are connected to illiteracy. We are resolved to prevent the collateral damage that is incurred by our students, especially the most vulnerable among them, when adults have limited access to the convergent scientific evidence. Research has yielded proven assessment and instructional practices with which every teacher and leader should be equipped. We believe that providing educators with this knowledge is a moral imperative. We are committed to evidence-aligned reading instruction being scaled with a sense of urgency in a comprehensive and systematic way by multiple stakeholders. We know that our children can be taught to read properly the first time. In a knowledge economy, the currency of the 21st century will be built on the foundation of skilled reading. Students who can read well have a place at the table of opportunity, whether their aspirations lead them to preparation for college or the workforce. We believe in a future where a collective focus on applying the science of reading through teacher and leader preparation, classroom application, and community engagement will elevate and transform every community, every nation through the power of literacy. Join us.
I just love that. Thank you, Tracy. I just get, every time I hear it, it just gives me chills. So thank you for tuning in today, and thank you for the privilege of being here with you today. And please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of any help to you. So thank you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Laura. One person did ask a last minute question, the statistics about the minutes required to close gaps by grade level. She asked, was that per day? I would assume that is per day.
Yes. Yes. And that's Joe Torgeson's work. Yeah.
Right. Which is highly impactful once you get into middle school. There are not those minutes in the day. So that's
that's the takeaway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And then somebody else asked, what would you recommend for district-wide admin training on the science of reading, in addition to the recommendation you just gave? I think that for sure the Reading League ones are very powerful.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely check out, if you want something virtual, you can check out the short course I mentioned. If you want something live, check out the Reading League. Just go on our website under professional development. There's a button you can, enter your information, and we'll follow up with you.
Okay. And I can't stress enough how important that is for district leaders to have that knowledge, because to me, it's that piece of, I need to know what I need to know in order to lead and not be led in a different direction when this is primarily our goal. Like when this is the work, I need to know what the work is as a leader.
Yeah, exactly.